So our position was that essentially the U.S. is not a democracy in any meaningful sense. It's become a system of institutionalized bribery. So we really meant by the 1%. They're not only the people who get all the profits from economic growth, they're the people who make all the campaign contributions. So practically 99%, 98.5, I think, of it. So essentially they're people who've managed to turn their wealth into political power and their political power into the means of acquiring new wealth, largely by reducing the entire population into debt. And essentially the laws that regulate the banks are now written by the banks, and it's all designed. So finance capital, finance is just other people's debts. It's all manipulated. So we weren't going to join the system, because joining the system, which is a system of bribery, is like saying, well, if you want to get rid of the system of bribery, you need to raise more bribes and compete with the other people. And, obviously that wasn't going to work. But when they realized we were serious about it, suddenly, after this Russian, there was this complete media blackout. So I think that in terms of what happened, I think what could have happened was what's happened in other places, which is a broad delegitimation of the system. The short version is I feel that the right-wing radicals have a much better allies than the sort of moderate right or the mainstream right in America than radical left has allies with the mainstream left. I mean, as soon as anybody threatens Second Amendment gun laws, the entire Republican establishment goes crazy. They don't like those militia people. They think they're insane, but they want them around because it makes them seem like a reasonable alternative. And the the Democrats in America have not learned this simple lesson that you can't betray your radicals on policy issues if you've already betrayed them on existential issues.
What you have is this crazy bureaucratization of capitalism, so that in fact these bureaucratic classes, who are like the most unimaginative people who ever lived, right? Are trying to have essentially taken over the engines of capital accumulation. So capital accumulation even happens through bureaucratic means. Not only are the bureaucrats, the administrative class has been absorbed into it, all of capitalism works that way. It's even utopian. It occurred to me the other day. They used to say, "Oh, the Soviet Union was all those experiments are impossible. This is why capitalism is necessary, because anything else is utopian." You're trying to force people into molds in which they will not fit. You try to get people and convince them some ideal of behavior that they won't live up to, and then when you realize they won't live up to the rules and regulations you've created, then you punish them. Right, and send them off to the gulag for not going along with your ideal. That's why utopianism is bad. Actually, capitalism now works almost exclusively through utopianism of this sort. I'll give you a reason why I think this. J.P. Morgan Chase, largest bank in America, I think it's the most profitable firm. Anyway, it's up there. 85% of their profits in the last year that I checked came from fees and penalties. Think about that. So basically what they do is they make up a set of rules that they know you can't follow, and then they punish you for not being able to do it right. That's how capitalism now works.
I would like to make three arguments. So this sort of takes the form of a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. One is that there seems to be a profound shift since the 70s from investment in technologies associated with the possibility of alternative futures to technologies that furthered labor discipline and social control.
Basic image. Whereas, of course, most labor is not actually productive if you think about it. Like, you make a glass once, right? But you wash it like 1,000 times. Most labor isn't about making things, it's about keeping things the same, maintaining things, nurturing things, giving them an environment in which they can grow, caregiving, caretaking. But then the question is, how do you validate work? Well, you just say you go back to the Puritan idea. Work is valuable in itself. If you're not working really hard at something you don't like, well, you're not a very good person. You're a parasite. So that's how you can have the situation now where people actually think their work is more valuable if they don't get anything out of it. So even if you know that you're doing something good for the world, in a way you should be paid less. People think it's okay, like nurses should be paid less, or, because they're actually contributing, or teachers, because they're contributing to the world. So I think that we need to massively reevaluate this. If we're going to take off again, we need to start thinking about what makes work actually valuable, which is that it actually it's a form of care for other people. It benefits people in a concrete way, and nobody can really decide how that happens other than the people doing it. So I think if we're going to try to have that conceptual revolution, which can overcome this notion of job creators, and that everybody left and right, when they have they're always calling for more jobs and more work. I think because the only way they can see people as valuable is that they're like doing something they don't like very much, whether or not there's any need for it. We've caught ourselves in a conceptual trap, and I think only notions of basic income can start us reevaluating what it is we actually value about what we do. The thing that people in power fear the most is a population that, has basic security and time. It's true of a lot of people in government, more and more as time goes on. Their real job is to make you kind of feel like you're inadequate, that you're undeserving, and I realize that that's what government does. All these neoliberal reforms, which are supposed to put conditionalities on welfare and make things more efficient, they're framed in this moralizing terms. But what they actually end up doing is creating these huge class of people to sort of monitor you and make you think you're just not doing a very good job in life. And these bureaucracies operate, are creating all of these jobs where people are essentially, telling you that value comes from paperwork rather than from anything anybody actually does. I think that we could be talking about names, but it strikes me that insofar as it would be possible to have a social organization where most people are not actually simply subordinates following orders and a command structure, and in which you do not have institutional government guarantees of various types of monopoly and rent rights. It would be hard for me to think of that as capitalism or see what the point of calling it would be. The third element I think we have to talk about is growth. Capitalism from its origins has been based on the assumption that you need a certain amount of growth of production of goods and services in order for the entire system to remain stable. At the moment we are engaged, at the cusp of an ecological crisis where what had been considered normal rates of growth are clearly unsustainable. It seems to me very difficult to understand how a profit-based system, such as exists today between competing corporations, would be able to maintain itself under a situation of sustainable levels of growth.
To always examine authority critically to see if it's legitimate.
Yeah.
And I think there are forms of authority that are legitimate, but you don't worship authority as a thing in itself.
Yeah.
And the really sophisticated forms of knowledge are the people on the bottom who are being analyzed, who have to manage the stupidity of those who have access to violence on the top. I mean, anybody who's had a job where somebody has the arbitrary power to fire you knows that the workers have to know what's going on and the boss doesn't. And similar with gender relations, in any patriarchal society, women know what's going on in men's heads much, much more than men know what's going on in women's heads. And, men will always make jokes about, you can't figure out women. They're such strange creatures in a situation where men have basically arbitrary power over them. Women never say that about men because they actually have to understand men. So that and this is what I was referring to when I talked about the sort of fractured structures of imagination. In most social situations involving structural violence, the people on the bottom, and I've read African American authors write about the same thing, about the elaborate ethnographies that in the Old South black communities would have, trying to figure out how white people think. They have these very, very elaborate ethnographies of white people because you need to do that, whereas the white communities just had no idea what was going on. Almost always people on the bottom actually have more knowledge, have to do more imaginative labor. So the imagination gets displaced onto the bottom. And as a result, and this is where you get back to that notion of reality in large objects, that there is also a right-wing and left-wing political thought is all about recognizing different aspects of that complex relation of imagination and violence that takes place in situations of structural inequality. That very fact about violence actually gives it a quality which almost all other forms of action lack, which is that you can have relatively predictable effects on the actions of other people about whom you understand nothing. any other way you want to actually affect some other person's actions, you have to have some idea of what they think is going on, who they think they are, who they think you are, what they want, what they fear. But if you shoot them or hit them hard enough, that kind of becomes irrelevant. This is why violence is the preferred weapon of the stupid. On the other hand, I've utter disproportionate means of violence, and you don't. I don't have to do much imagining. There's a phenomenon of imaginative labor that we're all engaged in at any given time. And what violence does, and rules enforced by violence, is one of the few means that you can totally cut through. It's precisely in situations of structural violence, such as I've defined them, that you don't actually see the physical violence going on, but where this is the most effective.